Hey, how are you?
I'm well. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. Okay, I don't know very much about finance, right? And I am going on 32. You have barely cracked 30 and you are managing other people's money. So, how did that happen? Is that something that was like really instilled in you as a child, or did something happen to you in life where you just became very focused on finance?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I actually come from an immigrant family, and that has largely shaped, my life, my aspirations, and my perspective. And so, just knowing where my parents come from, my parents are from Guyana. I was born in St. Lucia, and just sort of knowing where they come from and witnessing our family's trajectory, really shaped my perspective on money, legacy, wealth, and even manifestation, right? And so
Mhm.
growing up, my mother's mindset around money and ownership, it really,
You got something going on in the background.
it's my Alexa. My mother's mindset around ownership and, equity really had a profound influence on me. And that really sparked my desire to be a business owner. And
Okay.
so after college, I pursued my MBA and started working in finance. And as I was interviewing at different firms, I quickly realized that the industry at large was relatively the same. All of the firms I interviewed with had the same culture. They were built on the same business models that I,
Mhm.
viewed as broken. And I just felt like it was going to be unfit for my generation. And so after spending some time working in the industry that's reserved for wealthy baby boomers, I thought that I could provide financial planning and wealth management services more efficiently for my generation. And so with ownership being the end goal, I just really took the time to become a student of the industry and devoted my time to a deep learning of my craft. And from that moment on, I just became committed to creating a firm of my own working with millennials in technology.
So working with millennials, you said unfit for your generation. You felt like the other business models were. So, as somebody that is a millennial that is interested in being more fiscally responsible, what is sustainable for us? What is kind of like, how do you start? Say I'm working, maybe I make 70K a year. There's future planning, but there's also investment. And I think that even knowing the difference between those or the levels between them can be overwhelming for people.
For sure. But I really think that if you're feeling overwhelmed, taking a few simple steps now can really help you gain control, and more importantly, peace of mind. Mastering your money is it's more than just making the math work out. It's really about adjusting your mindset as well. As you begin to take charge of your finances, you'll change your philosophy as much as you can as it pertains to your day-to-day habits. And so it's important to take, at least in the beginning, take a mental inventory of, your current position. Are you consistently overspending? Do you have enough saved up to survive an unexpected expense? I think the past 3 months has really shown us how important it is to have an emergency fund, and to really, maybe think twice about, job security. We've seen record numbers of unemployment over the past 3 months. And so I think that's sort of the first step, is really just being honest about yourself, about where you currently are and where your weaknesses are. And
Mhm.
then it should then turn into, well, how do I, now build a money management blueprint? How do I, put my savings plan into action? What are some things that I need to do to get to that next step? And I do think that it's important to understand those things I just spoke about a second ago, to then, think about what really is that next step for me, what's manageable and what's not. And so a lot of times I think, it just boils down to, if we want to give you, actionable tips, it really boils down to putting money aside regularly and consistently that
Mhm.
can be invested towards your future, and leaving money to grow alone, which means, you would need an emergency fund. And so I think those are sort of like the ground level things that you have to do. I like to tell people, you wouldn't build a house from the roof to the basement. You start from the basement and to the ground up. And so these are sort of like the ground level things that are important to sustainable sustainable financial wealth.
So, okay. So just to run it back really quickly, step one, start setting money aside regularly.
Yes.
That's what we would say step one is. And so
Yeah.
step two would be to start assessing your spending habits. Right. And then step three would be what, do you know, deciding long-term goals, or
I would say step three is figuring out, well, what's important to you, right? We could have, student loan debt. You could want to buy a home. You could want to get married and start a family. I think you have to identify, well, number one, which one is more important, which of the three or four, however amount of goals you have, are urgent, right? What are you willing to bend a little bit for to accomplish, that number one priority goal? A lot of times there's so many things that we want to do. And we don't necessarily have all the resources it takes to bring those things into fruition. So at that moment, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, am I willing to put off buying a house for, the next 3 or 4 years or so in order for me to focus on these student loans and knock that out? Or, focus on saving for this ring and proposing, to my girlfriend or something like that. So I think that you have to understand the priorities, because when you try to do all of it, that's usually where people go wrong.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, we hear all the time that the value of the Black dollar, but then we also hear the narrative about Black families not having any wealth in the household, and, that not being a conversation that we have early on, a difficult conversation about priorities and management and all of that. And so I guess, what, in your opinion, since this is where you're working, I don't know, what kind of impact do you think that that the pandemic has really had on millennials in terms of Black buying power and where they see themselves overall, like in the marketplace? And before you take that on, I want you to think about that somewhat in the context of the My Black Receipt, I guess, initiative that was started by Keziah Williams. And we're going to be talking to her later this month. But just the big push for supporting Black businesses, the sustainability, the Black dollar, kind of lay that out for me. I know that's such a loaded question. Unpack so much, but we have time.
Such a loaded question. So I think it's important to understand a few things, right? Okay. So for every $100 a white family has in wealth, Black families hold just $5.04. Wow. More than 1 in 4 Black households have zero or negative net worth, compared to less than 1 in 10 white families without wealth.
Wow.
A recent report from the Institute of Policy Studies shows that wealth of the median Black household has declined from 1983 to 2013 by 75%. And if that trend continues, the median Black household wealth will hit zero by 2053. Meanwhile, the wealth for median white households have increased by 14% over that 20-year time frame I referenced a couple of seconds ago. So, I think it's important to understand those statistics. And I think they tell a very interesting story, but only half of the story. When you look at the how behind the numbers, it sort of all makes sense. When you have systematic racism, housing discrimination for years, redlining, these are all examples of how we were denied the ability to build wealth through home ownership. And, we know that has been the primary, source of wealth building tool for, years now. And so, not only did the ability to purchase homes give white families the ability to accrue wealth, it also attracted new businesses to those neighborhoods, which increased property values. It allowed homeowners access to other wealth building vehicles, like going to college, for example. As a result, the wealth in the white communities compounded and passed to future generations, while the opposite happened for Black communities. So, you kind of have to think about the benefit of how compounding interest works, right, in the stock market, and you investing and getting a 20% return, and so on and so forth. Wealth grows exponentially with time. Now, if you take that same premise and reverse it, disadvantages also grow exponentially with time. And that's sort of the position that we find ourselves in. And so when you reference, the Black receipt, where, Black consumers and allies spent, around $5 million with Black businesses from Juneteenth to July 6th, that says a lot. I think that if we're able to connect the consumer and the ally to Black entrepreneurs in a way where, we can track our dollars, we can track our expenses so that, Black entrepreneurs can do the work that they need to do to scale their businesses without necessarily depending on venture capital, which is a whole other issue in itself.
That's a whole other box of words.
That's a whole other, issue in itself. Right. And so, I think, for the most part, when Black entrepreneurs are well resourced, we're able to create jobs for our communities. And we know that, when our businesses are successful, they'll turn that income into assets. And these assets can then be passed down to future generations. And we can sort of get the cycle going, in that direction. And so I think that I am absolutely for it. And I agree with that movement 110%, the Black receipt movement I meant.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Samuel. Everybody, you guys need to go and follow him on Instagram. It is, go ahead, let him know your handle.
Yes, my Instagram and Twitter are both Samuel S. Deane. And it's pretty simple.
Pretty simple, but you should follow him. Maybe you can learn something. And have a great weekend. We're gonna hop back to Denise.
Thank you for having me.